Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Keeping Relevant. Today I'd like to talk about some of the Supreme Court's recent actions and maybe a little about the federal courts and the Congress and politics. And who better to do that with than my friend Dorothy Samuels, a 30-year veteran of the New York Times Editorial Board and a former fellow at the NYU Law School's Brennan Center. I'm so glad to have you. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Am I wrong, but is there more litigation involving politics these days in the federal courts? And, well, let's start with just the federal courts.
Well, it's been so dominant because the Republican candidate for president is in court a lot. You know, he's dealing with criminal and civil suits, and some of the issues involving trying those cases or reaching the courts, and so far he has succeeded.
Yeah. I'm wrong, though. It's not only him. Mm-hmm. It's the different states also, the actions. It's all a result, it seems to me, of his politics, of the
we live
to the
in a
right, the MAGA stuff, the attempts to limit voting access, all the different things that some of the states are trying to do, and then the things he's trying to do. And he, from the very beginning, has challenged, the vote from the last election.
Well, I think...
And the electors, and, constantly using the courts as a system.
Well, I think wiser people than me have observed that in today's society, there's almost no issue that doesn't become can become a legal issue.
Yeah.
And a lot depends on who the judges are who hear cases and their adherence to precedent and or whether they're agenda kind of judges, and we have a lot of them from past administrations. And the Supreme Court is, right there in the mix, accepting cases with a seemingly pretty brazen agenda to remake American law and American society to its liking. And what's really amazing is how, if you look back over the nearly 20 years, I think this is the 19th term of Chief Justice Roberts, the far right has had an agenda. The agenda was uplifting the Second Amendment and completely changing the interpretation to make it an individual right to have guns, and now that's extending. The question is how far this court is going to extend that right from the home, which is where the change began, saying you have a constitutional right to have a gun at home for self-defense. And then in the last decision a year ago, the court, in a very radical decision, basically said, you can't limit that. You have to look to traditions and point to something analogous in history in order for any gun limitation to float. And beyond guns, there's been a real effort to elevate religious rights over the general population, and basic principles that were there at the founding of our country as a basis of our liberty, the idea that church and state are separated, and that no religion should be superior to any other or get special rights over any other. that has been nearly eviscerated.
But that doesn't fit into that definition of the strict interpretation of the Constitution.
Well, they would claim, the decisions claim it does, and they've gone, gung-ho for observing a method of interpretation they call originalism, which, when you read the decisions, they aren't even good history. But more than that, if you base your decisions on looking at where things were in 1791 or before, when the Constitution was ratified, or before that, what you get is a world in which, the country belonged to white people who owned property, white men who owned property. Women had no rights. Black people were enslaved in various parts of the country, and to start measuring rights and what is what should be enforced in 2024 based on that, it's bizarre. I remember when Justice Antonin Scalia, many years ago now, came on the court. He called himself an originalist.
Was he the first to talk about that?
Well, I think he was the first on the court to say that should be the method.
Of, yeah.
And I remember thinking then, and some people wrote, that it's one thing to have one justice who has this strange way of looking at modern law, but we now have basically six folks who look at it. And the other thing is that we're now at a point, because we have six, which is a supermajority on the court, who are very extreme on the right, with, I would say, basically they are following a playbook that was not hidden from anybody. It's been the agenda for some time, and they're actually doing the things that they said they would do, but there is no middle. There's no Sandra Day O'Connor, so that there's always a chance. There's no Justice Kennedy, that you never knew exactly how a decision would play out. It depended on where that middle justice was, but there's
no middle ground.
Well, if the middle now, I guess, is Justice Roberts, but he doesn't give you a majority.
Yeah. He has a funny kind of light appearance, at least to me. I mean, he's not a heavy presence.
Well, he's very charming, and he always tries to present things as if they're not threatening, to overturn. He became a master at overturning without saying he was overturning.
Does the Federalist Society really, is it coordinating this effort? I mean, I can't remember ever seeing a Supreme Court that was anything like this one.
Well,
and nor do I remember before them the Federalist Society.
Well, the Federalist Societies are, relatively recent.
It's like an advocacy lobbying group, right?
Well, it's more than that. It's a group that is on the inside of government now, in a Republican Congress. They're very they've been very instrumental in choosing judges that are, far right.
They've most likely chosen a majority.
Not a majority, but the
new appointments.
A lot of the new appointments.
Before the
Biden is right. Trying to make up for that.
For McConnell.
Yeah, but some of the wackier decisions do come from Trump appointees. The Federalist Society, very openly was very involved in screening the Supreme Court nominees. Trump was able to get on the bench, and that's just very open. But more than that, they are very involved in spawning activity, not just on the federal level, but at the state level too. But the Supreme Court's basically opening of the floodgates for huge amounts of money have turned judicial elections into elections that are just as ideological and
So they've mounted a campaign against the whole judiciary system of the country.
well, that's not what they would say. They would
Yeah,
say,
but we would say that.
yes,
We could say that.
I mean, yes, and they've very successfully been able to capture large swaths of the courts that make decisions about individual lives. There have been historically other periods in American history where we've had courts that haven't been in tune with the general thrust of the American Constitution and the genius, which is the founders kept things relatively general to allow for our understanding of rights and liberty, to grow and alter with modern times as our understanding deepened and new groups emerged, calling on the court to vindicate their rights. We had the Dred Scott decision way back when that largely led to Lincoln's election. We had the battle over the courts with Franklin Roosevelt. There was a court that stopped all the New Deal legislation and led Roosevelt to threaten to, quote, pack the court. But this has been different. It's really been a drive to overturn and limit the meaning of liberty and equality in America.
No doubt.
And that continues, apace in a way that's very scary.
You used to do a lot of writing.
Yeah.
Are you less interested in it
Oh,
these
no,
days?
no.
Okay.
I think it's
I'm
the
interpreting
duty,
too much.
I think it's the duty of every citizen to be paying attention
Right.
to what's happening in this country and to do what they can to try and fight the move to dismantle our system of liberty and concept of justice.
There's no doubt about that. But when you hear people who say, well, they don't know if they're going to vote this year, isn't it enough to...
Well, it makes me crazy.
It's just enraging.
No, so you speak out as you can,
Yeah.
and I'm sure I'll be back
Well, I hope so.
to writing, but I think we've seen over the decades of my career, and given the things I was advocating being diametrically different
Absolutely.
as a direction for the court on civil rights and civil liberties, how effective that has been.
I'm trying to say that we've known each other for many years.
Yes.
And you were deciding what to do with your life.
That's right. I was the first female executive director of what was then the largest affiliate.
But how old were you when you did that?
Oh, I was 26, 27.
So there you were.
There I was. And I've been engaged in this sort of work and these issues since I was young, and always had, very young, being, like so many others, influenced by the JFK years. My goal in life was to be part of the mix and to fight to make the country better. And to be a muckraker is what I wanted to do. And I was very fortunate to have the opportunity, both as an advocate at first and being active in political campaigns, many of them losing, but and then having the opportunity to be at the Times, and which was, an incredible privilege and education, and to be there as we watched over time as the atmosphere in this country really began to change. Issues, you know, I was the person for a long time who every big election would write the editorials that would say the Supreme Court is on the ballot this election because whoever gets elected is going to, chances are, will get to appoint justices, and we now have a, you know, a very close margin here on big issues. And but even I was shocked and have been shocked by the aggressiveness of the assault and the nature of decisions rolling back rights or elevating religion, or at a time when this country needs to stop mass killings, to do something to rein in the guns, to rein in the money in the campaign finance sphere, and watching it go in diametrically the opposite direction. It's the aggressiveness has, on one hand, predictable. I wrote it that it's, you know, that it could be coming, but it's quite amazing. And that when you look at some of the decisions that have come down, the actual reasoning behind them are, you know, I used to like reading Supreme Court decisions because in a lot of cases, you know, on interesting issues, you would read the first part and you'd say, "Ha, they're right. That's right." But then you'd read the dissent and you say, "Oh, I didn't see that," and you would see at least reasoned discussion of actual legal issues. I mean, what are we supposed to think about the decision, the Dobbs case, the decision written by Justice Alito, where he, I think 6 times cites a judge going back hundreds of years who sentenced women for being witches? What am I supposed to think of that? And where the rights of women and the impact on women's lives isn't even considered. It's not even part of the decision. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is turning in her grave. She may not have liked the reasoning in Roe v. Wade, but she was a very strong advocate of abortion rights on the understanding that unless you give women the right to decide their own reproductive future and whether or not to have children and whether or not to preserve their health and well-being in the course of pregnancy, women could not be equal. It was, to her, it was an equality decision. Now, you know, we could go back to the days where we had the luxury of debating whether her analysis was right. I happen to disagree with her view that America was moving in the direction of a more liberal abortion policy at the time. Her argument was that the states were moving in the direction of a liberalized abortion, but that really stalled. And in any case, what ultimately really you know, fueled the movement for abortion rights was not only the general women's rights movement, but it was the fact that lives were being lost in pregnancy. And now to think we've entered a period like that again is appalling. To think of the lives and the lives that were lost and put on the line, the courage it took to get the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965 to have Justice Roberts just throw it out. At the same time, he's telling us in other decisions he wants to just be an umpire, and we're going to be modest. And he overturns a venerable congressional act that is absolutely needed today to go after gerrymandering and whatever that amounts to racial discrimination.
Is the life term in the Constitution? Is that?
Yes.
It
but,
can't be changed by legislation?
Well, there are discussions about that, but I think there is an increasing feeling in the last several years, probably certainly on the more progressive side, but also I think on the right in general, that it would make sense, given especially the humongous role the Supreme Court plays in our society, the extreme power that justices wield these days over American life and rights, that it should be limited. And what people talk about is the possibility of an 18-year
Because that's
term.
basically our only hope of changing.
Well, yeah, in the immediate future, barring some unforeseen development, that's true.
There's a move certainly to adopt some ethics, some ethical standards, right?
Well, people have from time to time raised ethical issues about the behavior. There was Justice Fortas, and while on the court, also advising the president, who is often a litigant in the Supreme Court. What's come to light in the last few years about the degree to which some of the justices, leading with Justice Thomas, have really disobeyed even existing law on disclosure, and have just really crossed and ignored what they said was their obligation to abide by the ethics code that lower level judges are required to abide by. The Supreme Court has no mandatory code of ethics. Justice Roberts, responding to criticism of Justice Alito for some things, and to Justice Thomas's real scandals, and the compromising of his position, has, got through a voluntary code, but it's not enforceable. It's not reviewable by any outside kind of monitors, right? And it's not followed, and that's really important because, among other things, what are Americans supposed to think when you have cases dealing with the insurrection, led by Trump, and his own wife was an active part of it.
I don't want to tell you this, but we've come to the end of the program.
Oh, no.
So you'd better start writing again. Because I think you have a lot. I think you have a lot to say.
Oh, well.
And I think we need to have it.
Well, I think
written.
I think
we need
Americans are at least some Americans are waking up, but we are on the precipice.
Not enough.
And a lot's going to depend on this election.
We need to feel we can really change what's happening. We need to feel that power. So thank you, Dorothy Samuels, and I look forward to talking to you more often and to reading your opinions.
Thank you.